If this thumbnail was puzzling, let me clarify that it'll not be that beautiful frog, but I would be taking a philosophical leap later on in this video. But before that, let's have a look at some lighter news about antinatalism that happened this week. One book I missed in the last week's updates was a new book in Spanish by Miguel Angel Castro Merino, and I'm not going to take the risk of reading the title, but a quick translation of the title says, "Welcome to this shitty life, an antinatalist pamphlet." Lawrence did a video talking about entry of antinatalism in Cambridge English Dictionary, but we seem to have another new entry in another dictionary. I should say that I don't understand the relation between various Oxford dictionaries. There are so many of them that they need a dictionary just to explain all these Oxford dictionaries. But it looks like antinatalism is added to Oxford Languages Dictionary as it has started appearing recently in the searches, or at least I have recently noticed it. Anyway, in his video about Cambridge Dictionary entry of antinatalism, Lawrence says it is unfortunate that antinatalism is associated with environmentalism.
Existence is a harm. Another thing I wanted to comment on is that they specifically include environmental motivations for antinatalism. Personally, I think it's unfortunate that there's a growing association between antinatalism and environmentalism.
Whilst I agree with his sentiment, and personally my antinatalism does not stem from eco-anxiety, which is a term for excessive worry about climate change, there was a nice and short 15-minute podcast on this subject about how, why, and how many people are going child-free, they don't mention antinatalism, due to climate anxiety on BBC. It interviews an Indian couple who have decided not to have children for this reason, their struggle with their families, as well as a woman who struggled to get herself sterilized, and the way she was treated as a potential property of a potential future husband. Talking of environmental antinatalism, a podcast called Non-Toxic interviewed Amanda and Mati, who tried to clarify the distinction between the two and many other types of antinatalism. Let's have a look at this short clip.
That for a lot of antinatalists, suffering is the core problem. And then the question is what to do about suffering. Is it just restricted to human suffering? Or, as you've said, it sounds like there are some thinkers who believe that all life is suffering and therefore all life should end. Other people seem to take the position that maybe humans are the cause of most of the suffering and therefore human life should end and we should let the rest of the earth continue spinning on without our presence. Can you just kind of lay out what those distinctions are and how you're thinking through them? Because I think, there is definitely a component of the climate movement who are described as kind of like doomers, essentially.
Yeah.
And they, I would say, basically have like a human antinatalist perspective where they think that humans are the cause of so much environmental destruction, and therefore we should let the human race, die out and give the planet a chance to recover. How are you all grappling with that idea?
Yes, I mean, what you're describing, I think, could most commonly be referred to as like anthropocentric antinatalism, or the voluntary human extinction movement essentially takes. I don't know that they would ever call themselves doomers per se, but they sort of take what's called a misanthropic view or use the misanthropic arguments for antinatalism that humans are causing all of this destruction, that humans should go extinct and that the animals should inherit the earth. So that's one form of antinatalism.
So yeah, it is true that humans are causing a lot of damage and a lot of harm to other animals as well as other human animals, but that is only part of the whole truth. The other part is that there is a lot of suffering that is going on without humans, and that has existed for millions of years before humans even appeared on the scene. The sentiocentric antinatalism is the view that while humans have not been good, they are the only chance other animals have to be rescued from this chain of suffering, which can go on for billions and billions of future years. With that said, however, some sentiocentric antinatalist philosophers like Mati Hari are against wild animal intervention, but even they hold the view that a world with no sentient beings in it is better than a world with them. This is also the view David Benatar holds. While we are on the shades of antinatalism, in the paper Famine, Affluence and Procreation, Benatar argues that we do not apply the label pronatalism only to the view that recommends maximal fecundity for all. Instead, we use the term, for example, to describe government policies that aim to increase population. A parallel use of antinatalism can be used to describe government policies that seek to reduce population growth. By extension, the term can also be used to automatic birth rate declines instead of government's antinatalist policies or in spite of their pronatalist policies. That is the topic of the opinion piece on globalissues.org, The Birthrate Blues. Total fertility rate is measured in average number of children per woman in a given population at a given time. If you want to maintain the population numbers roughly constant, then it is agreed that on an average the total fertility rate should be 2.1. That is because two children would eventually replace their parents and 0.1 is to compensate for accidental childhood deaths. This rate of 2.1 is called replacement level fertility rate. In the olden days, this rate used to be very high, but as more women got access to education and contraceptive technologies advanced, this rate has reduced drastically. This chart, for example, tracks total fertility rate over the period since 1950s for the entire world. As you can see, the total fertility rate in 1950s for the entire world was around 5. That is, on an average, every woman in the world had 5 children in a lifetime. That rate reduced to 2.3 by 2021. But not all countries follow the same path. Italy, for example, fell below the replacement levels in 1970s, and by 2021, Italian women were having on an average 1.28 children. China has gone even below Italy to 1.16, even though their one-child policy ended in 2015. But the queen of national antinatalism has been South Korea with 0.88 in 2021. Some sources are reporting that it has dropped to 0.7 by 2023 and by 2026 it will be 0.6. While this may look good to the traditional antinatalist eyes, we should be cautious in celebrating these reduced birth rates because not all of them have come from ethical concerns. For example, a variety of factors are blamed for Koreans' reluctance to have kids, ranging from high costs of housing to the competitive environment for children's education. Increasing gender tensions are another reason regularly highlighted. Nonetheless, it is true that birth rates are falling in many countries. This chart, for example, shows countries and their fertility rates as of 2022. The black line on the right is the replacement level of 2.1, and all countries shown here are those which are below that replacement level. As you can see, South Korea is at the top with around 0.8, followed by China, which is just over 1, followed by Australia, Spain, Italy, and so on, all the way to the most populous country today in the world, India, which is also below replacement level with fertility rate of about 2 children per woman. Birth rate below replacement level does not immediately result in population decline. Because unlike octopuses, which is another species of very intelligent individuals, human parents thankfully don't die immediately after giving birth. This chart shows the expected percentage of population reduction in different countries by 2050 and 2100. The percentages for 2050 are in blue, whereas those for 2100 are shown by red bars. As you can see, South Korea's population is expected to halve by end of this century. It is no surprise then that many governments are worried about this and are trying to apply pronatalist policies. These include China's Xi Jinping, Russian President Vladimir Putin, Hungary's Prime Minister Viktor Orban, Italy's Giorgia Meloni, and this sentiment has resonated with many Republicans in the United States as well. The article concludes with a cautious note saying while governments and others may wish to continue with pronatalist policies and programs, countries are not likely to succeed in their efforts to raise fertility rates back to or above replacement levels anytime soon. Accordingly, countries experiencing sustained levels of below replacement fertility and bemoaning the birth rate blues would be prudent to recognize demographic realities and prepare for and adapt to demographic decline and population aging. So with all this, it is not surprising that pronatalists are gearing up their agenda to have more kids. And just like antinatalists, they have shades within them too. Here's an article from an ultra-conservative end of pronatalism. An article in National Review, Natalism Is Not Enough, pushed the idea that it is not enough to ask for people to have more children, but that marriage should also be a prerequisite for such a propaganda. That's because it says marriage is more likely to lead to creation of new children and also is better for raising them. And not just any marriage, but only that which is within the bounds of church. To justify the need of marriage for having children, it had to oppose assisted reproductive technologies because then even single people or same-sex couples can have children. Calling assisted reproductive technologies a trap, it says not all prominent natalist inclined figures fall victims to this trap. Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni, for instance, has explicitly sought to increase Italy's birth rate while upholding her country's traditional ban on most technologically assisted reproduction. But the author forgot that his article started by proudly stating how Musk had 11 children with 3 women, many of whom were through assisted reproductive technologies and out of wedlocks. But the concerns for this propaganda are far more serious than these superficial contradictions. For example, they want women to remain in traditional childbirth nightmare where they have to take maternity leaves and be dependent on the state for help. The article says relying on technology to solve the problems of delayed marriage or unmarriageable men won't solve the underlying problems pushing fertility downwards. It could also reduce political support for actually pro-family policies such as paid leaves or a larger child tax credit. So individuals, especially women, being less in need of state's help is seen as a bad thing. It concludes by saying that the best way to address declining birth rates is to go to church, walk down the aisle, and get to work addressing the underpopulation crisis. Now, it is reasonable that if you want to address the problem of declining birth rates through pronatalist policies, then you want to do it in such a way that the children resulting from those pronatalist policies get to be raised in the best possible environment. But why do we want to have more children? Because it will boost the economy, or it will help continue the civilization or nation or any other such notional idea. Why do we want to have booming economy? Because it will help raise our children better so that they can become better citizens, boosting our economy. Or why do we want the civilization to continue? Because in it can thrive our children who want to have to continue the civilization. This circular logic is just I want to bring kids into this world so I can protect them from the harms of this world on a national scale. Suffering that those children have to go through for this circular zero-sum game is at best a collateral damage and at worst something that is not even considered. Coming back to the philosophy of antinatalism, Kane Baker is a qualified philosopher with PhD in philosophy and he runs a nice channel teaching about topics in philosophy. He recognizes that life is pretty terrible, this world is not a good place to bring someone into, and he does not regret humanity going extinct. So he does not want to have children and he himself has had a vasectomy. But he describes himself as an antinatalist adjacent and not technically an antinatalist, primarily because he does not want to tell others that it is morally wrong to have children. This week he made a very nice video explaining David Benatar's axiological asymmetry. In the video he explains the premises on which Benatar bases his asymmetry, the axiological asymmetry itself, other asymmetries around procreation which Benatar claims to explain through his axiological asymmetry, and also goes through some of the objections. Before I proceed further, I want to say that I have thought about those objections and I'm going to take a leap of stupidity in my confidence to explain why they are not correct. I say leap of stupidity because these are deep complex topics and I'm far from being anywhere near to any kind of philosopher, let alone a professional one. I do this only as a weekend activity. First objection is about presence of benefit being good, whereas absence of benefit being merely not bad. Surely good is better than not bad, so the side where X exists must be better, and Kane demonstrates that by assigning some values to each quadrant. Benatar has clarified that this is not the case because when one does not exist, one is not deprived of those absent benefits. Whereas when one exists, they would be deprived, and so the presence of benefits, although an advantage for those who exist, it is not a real advantage over those who don't exist. Second objection is from the view that Benatar's axiological asymmetry is person-affecting view and not an impersonal view. So the premise that absence of pain is good is actually absence of pain is good for the person who would have experienced it had he existed. But the problem is that absence of pleasure cannot then be said to be as not bad for the person who would have existed. We would have to say that absence of pleasure is bad for the person who would have experienced it had he existed. So we nullify the asymmetry. One clarification here is that pain and pleasure are examples of harms and benefits of life. Benatar uses them likewise in the book, and he has clarified in an interview that in retrospect he would have corrected that. Anyway, it makes it easier to think in terms of pain and pleasure while being mindful of the fact that they are examples of harms and benefits of life. Underlying to these objections is the assumption that just like pain, which has negative intrinsic value, pleasure also has a positive intrinsic value. That is, it is valuable in and of itself. Generally speaking, that is not the case. One of the preconditions for us to experience most of the pleasures is that we have to be deprived of them. So imagine that you have never eaten ice cream, you don't know what it tastes like, and other people haven't told you that it tastes so good. So maybe when you eat ice cream for the first time, you experience the pleasure because it tastes so good and you have discovered it for the first time. But now, after experiencing that gustatory orgasm, you develop a desire for more of such experiences, which generates deprivation if those desires are not satisfied. Most of our pleasures are satisfactions of such desires. I call this a desire satisfaction view. On this view, we can redraw the asymmetry in this way, and I know I'm flying way above my pay grade here, as this ought to be constructed carefully by qualified philosophers and not a random half-assed YouTuber like me, but still, if you draw the asymmetry such that instead of presence of pleasure, you say satisfaction of desires, and instead of absence of pleasure, you say absence of desires, then surely you can see that satisfaction of desires, even though good for the existing person, is no advantage when no such desires exist to start with. This explains the first objection. Recall that second objection was that if absence of pain is good for the person who would have experienced it had he existed, then absence of pleasure is bad for the person who would have experienced it had he existed. This can be modified on desire satisfaction view to say that absence of desire is not bad for the person who would have experienced it had he existed. So the premises are: presence of pain is bad for the person who experiences it, satisfaction of desires is good for the person who experiences it, absence of pain is good for the person who would have experienced it, absence of desires is not bad for the person who would have experienced it. Now, presence of desires and sentient existence almost always coincide with each other, so much so that many schools of Hindu and Buddhist philosophies recognize that to materially exist is to have desires and prescribe renunciation of those desires as a path to liberation. Even many modern antinatalists think of sentient beings as need machines. It is truly very hard to imagine a living sentient being with no desires at all. That is why I think the original premise was worded with the clause, unless there exists somebody for whom this absence is a deprivation. If all that is too technical, it will help to think that one has to always go through some kind of suffering in life, whereas nobody is ever harmed by not coming into existence. Another objection is that this calculation of pleasure and pain or harms and benefits is not the full picture. There are more things to life than just this. Here Keynes says, for example, when we consider other types of goods, does the asymmetry still hold? Many people think that knowledge is a good in and of itself, regardless of whether there is any pleasure associated with acquisition of knowledge. So if we insert knowledge and ignorance in place of pleasure and pain, we see an asymmetry like this, where the presence of ignorance is bad, the presence of knowledge is good, the absence of ignorance is good, even if that good is not enjoyed by anyone, and the absence of knowledge is not bad unless there is somebody for whom that absence is a deprivation. But while evaluating this, Keynes says that the presence of ignorance isn't bad in itself. My ignorance of cars and football isn't a problem. And there I think is a mistake. If we had assumed that knowledge is an intrinsic good, that is good in and of itself, then ignorance has to be intrinsically bad. The problem is assigning intrinsic good value to knowledge. We might like to believe that we live to seek knowledge for the sake of knowledge, but in reality it always serves some utility. Even when the knowledge might not have any practical use, like say some trivia about some reality show, it provides the utility of entertainment. The mere act of seeking out knowledge can serve to give meaning to our lives, but that is still an instrumental good and not an intrinsic good. Secondly, even if we were to accept intrinsic good value of knowledge, which by the way even Benatar has argued for in his interview with Jordan Peterson, there is a fundamental asymmetry of good and bad things which apply. There is always going to be vast amounts of knowledge that you will never gain. Also, loss of knowledge would occur easily and spontaneously. For example, if you lose touch of a technology, then you forget it after some time. But you have to strive to gain knowledge and keep it afresh. Of course, that is a different asymmetry than axiological asymmetry we are talking here. But the point is, you don't necessarily have to reduce everything to hedonistic pain-pleasure calculus to accept the axiological asymmetry as well as the fundamental asymmetries.